Hey guys, welcome back to another lesson. Before we begin today, I want to make sure you have seen the Chapter 8 and 9 quiz. I've posted this quiz through Google Forms. So you will be able to use Open Book, look at your previous information in order to answer this. So make sure you take a look at this and complete this before you do the online lesson for this week. This is a review of everything we learned from mercantilism and imperialism and colonialism and slavery. Okay, so it's the last 3 weeks kind of combined. There's some multiple choice questions. There's also some short answer and some long answer. So if you're doing one of the long answer, make sure you're putting it into full sentences and using as much information as you can from your assignments. This week's lesson is on All right, let's get started with this week's lesson. Before we begin, a little bit of review. Last week's lesson was on the transatlantic slave trade. So make sure that you can describe what the transatlantic slave trade was and the effects that it had on people in the past and is having on people today. The theme of today's lesson is cultural contact. We're going to look at the effects European contact had on indigenous peoples in North America. You can see I've included a photograph there of the same boy kind of as a before and after as an example of what we're going to be looking at, the effects it had on people. So your learning goals for today is I can describe what effect the arrival of Europeans had on the indigenous peoples in North America. So what is cultural contact? Cultural contact occurs when two or more cultures meet and begin to share their way of life. They may share goods, technology, languages, religion, government, and even diseases. This is what happens around the world, and it's happened for our history of humans. We are always sharing culture. That's what culture is. It's a mix of things that people have learned from the past, learned from other groups, and it gets blended together to create the culture that you live in today. Cultures can also mix by having people. Cultures can also mix by having children. People might marry in between two different cultures, and then it creates a group of people who have a blend of 2 or 3 or more different cultures together. Cultural contact in North America is when Europeans arrived in North America and they began to build colonies. They changed the way of life for the people that were living here. They changed the way of life for indigenous people. They also changed the land, the number of animals, and the way that North America looked. I've got a little cartoon here. He says, "How's this? You teach us how to irrigate and plant corn, and we'll decimate your tribe and name a baseball team after you." So I want you to think about the way you live today. As we're stuck in our homes and we're going through quarantine, we might feel very disconnected from nature, to the land, to the outdoors. We often feel in our way of life that we have to own things, that things belong to us. We often view nature as something separate from our indoors. So do we understand nature or our natural world, or do we feel that we're often stuck inside, glued to our phones? Because for the most of human history, life was not this way. We lived outdoors, but over the last period of time, we've created kind of a worldview of So I want to go over the worldview of what Europeans looked like as they started to colonize. And the idea of the European worldview is that humans would make up the most important thing on Earth. So the humans would be at the top of the pyramid. Animals would be below that, then things like fish, reptiles, and insects, and at the bottom would be the plants, the flowers, and trees. And it's the idea that humans were dominating everything else as the most important aspect in the world. And if you believe this way, or if you think this way, then you're not going to think as hard about maybe chopping down trees for your own benefit, or for taking out all the fish of the ocean for your own benefit. This is very different than the worldview of many indigenous peoples, in this case called Aboriginals on this slide. At the first time of contact, the Aboriginal worldview was that everything was connected together and equal. So you can see humans are no more important than plants or trees or sun or animals or water. Everything was equal and connected together. And the idea is that on Earth we have to live within harmony with one another, and that one does not get to take more than another. So these worldviews are obviously very different. Indigenous people viewed all parts of nature as equal. Europeans placed humans as the most important being on Earth. And those two different worldviews kind of drove the ideas of what was happening during colonialism. Europeans arrive on the land and they look at trees and fish and animals as a way to make money. Indigenous people lived on the land and they looked at those things as a part of how they shared the world. Even the way they lived or slept together in tribes would have been very different. So for example, an Iroquois tribe slept in large longhouses, and you would be around your closest relatives all the time. People would share living spaces, sleeping spaces, water, food, clothes. You would feel very connected to the people living with you. The European worldview is more that maybe we live with our family, but we have kind of our own house, and we are a little more isolated and separate from others. During the 1600s, thousands of Europeans started to move to North America to build colonies. This meant that the towns grew bigger and bigger, thus needing more and more resources such as wood and timber and building supplies to continue to build your cities. As towns like Quebec or Montreal or New York became bigger, that pushes the indigenous people further and further away from the ocean inland, causing wars with other tribes because now they might have to fight over food and land more in the interior. So this starts to really upset the balance of power and the way people were living in North America. Here's a little video clip from Crash Course on the early English settlers and their experiences with the native population in North America. It was during this time that the fur trade was taking off. This was helped a big important step in creating what would become modern Canada. Is Europeans were interested in making money. North America was rich in resources such as trees, animals, water, and fish. Beaver furs were also used to make very popular hats at the time. So these hats were kind of like a fancy hat that a lot of wealthy people over in England and France and Germany would wear. And so that meant these furs could be sold for a lot of money overseas. So fur traders made deals with the indigenous peoples who knew where to find the best furs and how to hunt and trap for them. England and France were competing for the best furs. England's king claimed a huge part of North America for his country. This large part of land was known as Rupert's Land, and it was all the land that went around the Hudson's Bay. So if a river drained to the bay, that became part of England's claim to the best furs. Remember, the European worldview says that humans are able to purchase things and to own things and own nature. So the idea of claiming it would have been very new to most of the indigenous tribes. The indigenous peoples were losing much of their traditional territory. Here's a little video clip that reviews kind of the beaver trade and how it kind of impacted what became Canada. In the 1700s, Canada continued to grow. Cities became larger, and more settlers arrived from England and France. Forests were cleared to make room for farmland. Jobs were created, such as shipbuilding and cattle farming. Fish stocks decreased as many were sent to England. Indigenous peoples died of diseases such as smallpox, lack of food, and loss of land for hunting and fishing. There's a little video clip here I posted from what was called Canada, the Story of Us. It's just a few-minute clip that I want you to watch. The whole thing is about 50 minutes, so if you want to watch the whole video, you go for it. But I've linked just the portion that might be interesting for our lesson. So what kind of goods were being traded? Well, from the First Nation cultures, they were trading furs, food like corn and potato, fish, timber, minerals, raw resources. They were also, First Nations were sharing a lot of their culture. So they were teaching the fur traders about how to grow certain plants, where to find wildlife, the knowledge of the natural resources in the land and the rivers, how to hunt, how to fish, how to find medicines from the ground that could keep you healthy through the winter. Europeans and the fur traders were sharing things like metal items, so knives and axes, guns, tobacco, alcohol, horses. So the idea of First Nations and Indigenous people having horses that they could hunt bison on, that was actually new and brought over by Europeans. They also brought ideas of how to manufacture and build things using industrial technology, like what we talked about during the Industrial Revolution. Bison were very important to the Indigenous people in Alberta. They hunted them for food, clothing, homes, and decorations. Every part of the bison was used. Bison's furs and tongues were worth a lot of money to European hunters. They did not care if they wasted the animal. Many bison were hunted almost to extinction during the 17 and 1800s. Without the bison, many Indigenous tribes would starve. So here's an example of the major effects the arrival of Europeans had on the Indigenous peoples, including things like their food source and their livelihood. So when Indigenous people would hunt a bison, like we said, they used the entire animal. Nothing went to waste. And they often would have to say a prayer once you've killed the animal, as like a thank you to the Creator for giving you this nourishment, because it's going to help feed your family and carry on your life. You can see all the cool little ways that the bison animal was used to benefit them. There's a video clip here from a movie called Dances with Wolves, and you can see where the amount of bison that used to roam the plains was in the millions, and this included Alberta. So if you went back a couple hundred years ago, there would have been bison herds in the tens of thousands roaming across the prairies, and you could actually hear like a thunderous roar when they would move because there'd be so many of them. Unfortunately, because their tongues and their hides were worth money to the hunters, most of the bison population was driven almost to extinction. This clip shows you kind of the sadness that many of the Indigenous tribes felt as their food supply and way of life was being destroyed. Luckily, bison today still exist, and we've done a decent job at creating places where they can live and flourish. They're not allowed to be hunted in these areas, and they basically just live in the wild and eat, and because of this, the numbers have increased and gone up very high. If you've ever been to Elk Island Park, just east of Edmonton, you can go and see bison and get up actually very close to them. Hopefully you get to go once the coronavirus quarantine